sit back and relax with strawberries and Prosecco. It's time for some tennis. Today on ChinnyVision, I'm looking at 7 tennis games for 8-bit computers, but not the one we're looking at the moment, which is tennis for the BBC Micro, because it's so bad that I decided not to include it in this roundup because it's basically unplayable. And we're going to start off today with the first big UK tennis game. It's by a company you may associate more with handheld computers, Psion, for we're looking at Match Point. We're starting on C64, coded by D&L Research. It's a 1 or 2 player tennis simulation, and yes, there is something wrong with your legs when you run along. Does anybody actually stand like that? I don't know. But although it looks like a very slow and awkward tennis game, actually, it's quite fun. You get plenty of time to think about where you're placing your shot. There's ball boys simulated, 2-player mode, and you can have loads of fun here on your 64. Even if it does look very basic by latest standards, the Spectrum version is, of course, the iconic version, voted the second best simulator of 1984 by Crash Readers, and also CMVG Game of the Month for September 84, and on the Speccy and C64 alone, the 9th best-selling game of 1984. Not something you'd associate with Psion, and a year later the Amstrad version comes out, and it's a slight improvement on the Spectrum version. It's a little bit orange. It's got a nice turn of speed to it. You get some good rallies going. And this is the first tennis game I ever played on a computer. Atari Tennis, aka Real Sports Tennis, on the Atari 8-bit home computers. Also available for the 2600 and 5600. It's a 1983 game. But you can get some nice rallies going on in this game. There are a couple of game modes. And of all these games today, it's the one where you can get a nice back and forth going. It plays more like a cross between Pong and tennis. Pong with the rules of tennis. So you really get some rallies up. There's not too much faffing around with balls going off the court and all that stuff with other more realistic tennis games. It's a lot of fun and has a bit more pace than Match Point. But perhaps you prefer your tennis a little bit more realistic and in 3D. What about International 3D Tennis by Palace, coded by, yes, Sensible Software? And we look at the C64 version. It looks, well, ugly and odd, but it's very easy to play. You've got multiple angles you can watch from, and you select those on the keyboard, and the frame rate is decent. We look at the Amstrad version, and your player will flash when you need to hit the ball to help you. Certainly on the easier game mode, your player will also run towards the ball again to assist you. Not sure if that happens on the harder levels, but there are all these viewpoints. And on the Speccy, because of a tribute clash, instead of the character you playing flashing, the little box appears at the bottom of the screen and flashes. International 3D Tennis on the Speccy, Crash gave it 78%, YS 75%. It looks so basic and odd, yet it is great fun. And it's also available on the 16 bits and is even more polished over there. Only got £2.99 to spend on a tennis game? Well, Mastertronic via the Mad label have the answer for you with lawn tennis or Grand Prix tennis, as it says on the cover, which is confusing. Available on the CPC and Spectrum only. An isometric view with some really weird ball physics and a slightly odd control system. It really is a little bit peculiar at times when you have to hit the joystick in a certain direction in order to get certain shots, and you have to get the timing dead on. I was going to do a full review of this game on the Spectrum and Amstrad, and I found it far too fiddly. I just couldn't get very far at all in terms of rallies. And I was looking at, we're over on the Spectrum version now, I was looking at the reviews by the likes of Crash and YS, and Crash gave it 23% and said the graphics are dismal, it has an absurd control method, and is a poor attempt to simulate a sport that is easy to play on home computers. And yeah, the Spectrum version is particularly dismal. The Amstrad version at least has a nice look to it. It lures you in with those graphics, but eventually you'll just get frustrated and not want to play it anymore. Konami have a tennis game on the MSX, and it reminds you of ping pong, with slightly worse animation and slightly worse gameplay. A little bit more basic than that, but there is a nice fluidity here in the gameplay, getting the ball back and forth. It doesn't have that cuteness ping pong has, or as I say, the fluidity or that general feel of being rather slick. What it does do is play a competent tennis arcade game on your home computer and makes it fun. There's always a fine line on tennis games, how complex the controls are, how much you have to time the service to get it precisely right. And this is a game like Atari Tennis you can just pick up and play very, very easily. But Chinny, I don't remember there being UK home computer versions of Konami Tennis. Well, there wasn't for the C64 and the CPC, but there was for the Spectrum, coded by Choice Software. And yes, it's a sudden step down from the MSX version, and the worst thing is it doesn't feel fluid at all. The animation is quite poor, and it just lacks that smoothness, that fluidity of the MSX version, which makes it all rather frustrating to play. It's just too much of a step down, and you can perhaps see why Ocean, aka Imagine, didn't bother to port this to the Amstrad, although bizarrely also didn't port it to the C64 either, which should at least be able to do the smoothness of the MSX. YS gave Konami Tennis on the Spectrum 6 out of 10 Crash. Pretty much agree, giving it 60%. Do you fancy something a little bit more modern in 8-bit terms? Well, Andre Agassi Tennis on the Sega Master System, 1993. Lots of gameplay options, you may match in a tournament. Most of the games do that. Singles, but also doubles. And you can select your player. Andre Agassi there, who looks nothing like Andre Agassi. So Jason Donovan gone wrong. Tiger Ball. Who's Tiger Ball? Don Matt, George King, Bob Chin. Let's play Bob Chin. Now, of course, being a later game, this has all the graphical affectations of the early 90s. And that means nicer graphics and really bad animation because, of course, the Sega Master System can't animate this kind of stuff smoothly. So you're looking at this thinking, it doesn't look bad. But it's a really weird game to play because the control just feels so jerky and delayed. And it almost feels like you're playing the game via elastic on your controls at times. You can get some rallies going and there are doubles options, but you can see here the animation is so poor when you've got 4 players on the screen and you just can't get any response from the player sprites. It's just all over the place. It's a shame because in a still screenshot, this looks fantastic, and watching it at times on here, you're probably thinking I might like to give that a go, but ultimately your pressures on the joypad are just too detached from what's happening on the screen. So can Codemasters save us on the budget front with Pro Tennis Simulator, not to be confused with Professional Tennis Simulator by Dynamic. And a tune on the 64 you've definitely heard before, I have, can't quite place it. Codemasters always ones for reusing tunes. Big sprites, smooth animation, and yes, satisfying sound effects, and you can get a rally going. Serving is a little bit fiddly to get the timing right, but this is much more like it. The game incidentally uses a code system when you load it up to prevent piracy. And if you enter the code in wrong, you end up with Mr. Naffo's Super Games 2 and 3, Mega Pong, and Super Snake. And which Coda says are his last ever C64 games. And you get a very nice Pong game, in the most basic sense. And this Snake game, which actually, you know what, it's really good. Over to the Amstrad with this horrifying loading screen. And yes, remember I've mentioned how fluidity is important on tennis games. This doesn't have it. It does have the variety of courts that all of these versions do, but it takes the worst aspects of the C64 version and then gives them jerky graphics. On the Spectrum, it's just as bad as the CPC. A little bit faster, but it still has a appalling animation that really detracts from the gameplay. Again, you feel detached from what the characters are doing on the screen, which I think is a fatal mistake with tennis games. So, that's 7 tennis games on the 8-bits. Which of these would I play today? Well, International 3D Tennis, without doubt. It's rather good. Don't be put off by those graphics. Actually, there's a lot here, and the difficulty levels really do add something to the game, as well as those angles you can view the game from. And it's great on all 3 of these systems. Atari Tennis, you can get some really good rallies going. It's very, very basic. Not something you're going to play for hours on end. But for a quick blast of tennis, especially against a friend, I don't think you can do much better, even if the graphics are rather basic. Match Point. I really like it on the Specky. It's just the right speed. It looks basic, but it plays well. And it's a rather iconic game. Second best simulator game in 1984, according to Crash, and I wouldn't disagree. CPC and C64, think you can find better tennis games on those systems. Lawn tennis promises much, but it ends up being a control system mess. Innovative idea, the kind of thing you can try out on budget. At least the CPC version has some nice presentation. Specky version looks rather dire and crashes 23% isn't unreasonable. Konami Tennis, I think the letdown here is you think it's going to be as good as Ping Pong and isn't. And that's a shame because actually the game is rather fluid and fun to play. Andre Agassi's Tennis is a classic example of trying to do too much on an 8-bit system. And that brings us to Pro Tennis Simulator by Codemasters. On the 64, I quite enjoyed it, and those 2 bonus games are really good. It's a shame the game is a massive letdown on the CPC and Spectrum. There are, of course, many tennis games across different computers. This is not a definitive list, but hopefully gives you a few ideas of things to try out or not to try out when you're next with your 8-bit home computer.